Norah, a 24-year-old healer with no wolf or known bloodline, is cast out of the Starfall Pack after years of loyal service because the elders see her as a burden despite everything she has done for them. Raised by the pack healer Isolda, after being found abandoned as a baby, Norah secretly possesses a mysterious power that awakens when she is 20, allowing her to create magical barriers that protect entire territories from a deadly supernatural force devastating neighboring packs. For years, she silently sacrifices her own health to maintain these barriers around Starfall, collapsing after each one, while the pack mistakes her exhaustion for weakness and eventually banishes her after Isolda dies. Even after being cast into the rain, Norah uses the last of her strength to build the strongest barrier she has ever created, saving the very people who rejected her before collapsing in the forest. Jonah, the only warrior who openly defended her, disobeys the pack searches for her, and rescues her near death, bringing her to the Kale Pack, where healer Petra and the community nurse her back to health and welcome her without judgment. As her strength returns, Norah creates a powerful barrier protecting the Kale territory, as well revealing to Jonah that her mysterious illness had always been the cost of shielding Starfall. When Starfall's final barrier eventually fails, the deadly force destroys much of the pack, killing Alpha Eli and many elders and survivors, including Olivia, Norah's closest friend, who failed to stand beside her seek refuge with the Kale Pack. Though deeply hurt, Norah chooses compassion over revenge, helping the refugees while making it clear that the old relationships cannot simply return to what they were. She then builds an even stronger permanent barrier for the Kale Pack, founded not on desperation but on the love and acceptance she has finally received. Witnessing the miracle, both Kale and Starfall survivors finally realize that Norah's years of unexplained sickness were the price she paid to keep others alive. The Kale Pack embraces her as one of their own, while Jonah finally confesses that he has loved her for years. Norah accepts his love, realizing she has finally found a true home among people who value her for who she is, rather than what they believe she lacks, fulfilling Isolda's lifelong lesson that true belonging comes from those who choose to see your worth. They slept safely that night, warm inside their borders, unaware that the woman they had cast into the rain had just saved every one of their lives. The night they cast her out, the sky looked like a wound. Bruised purple at the edges, angry and low, with clouds pressing down over the Starfall settlement as though the heavens themselves were leaning in to watch. The torches in the great courtyard had been lit in 2 long rows, and they burned in spite of the wind, in spite of the first thin needles of rain beginning to fall, because someone had made sure they would. Someone had wanted this to be seen clearly, every face illuminated, every witness accounted for. Norah stood in the space the crowd had made for her, not out of respect, but out of the instinct people have around things they consider tainted. And she kept her hands loose at her sides. She had decided somewhere between waking this morning and walking down here that she would not fold them, she would not hug herself. She would not give them the satisfaction of watching her hold herself together. She was 24 years old, she had lived inside this pack's borders for every year of her memory, and she had never not once belonged to them, but she had served them. She had bled for them in ways they would never understand, and tonight they had gathered in their hundreds to tell her she was not enough. Alpha Eli stood on the raised platform at the courtyard's head. He was not a cruel man. That was the thing about him that had always made this harder. He was measured and considered, and deeply, I genuinely convinced that what he did for the good of the pack. He had a wide, weathered face, gray beginning at his temples, and eyes the color of storm water. He looked at Norah the way a man looks at a difficult calculation he has finally resolved. Norah, just her name. No family name attached because she had none. That had always been the truth of it. This pack has deliberated at length. What I tell you now comes not from anger or haste, but from the considered judgment of your elders, your warriors, and your community. Community. The word moved through her like something cold. She found Olivia in the crowd without trying. Her best friend, her only friend really, if she were being honest in the way that hurt, was standing near the middle of the gathering, flanked by the women she ran with. But the women who had never known Olivia spent 3 evenings a week at Norah's door. Olivia was not looking at her, she was looking at the ground, and her jaw was set in the particular way it got when she was fighting something. Norah could see it from here, the guilt sitting in her body like something swallowed wrong. She looked away. Finding Olivia had been a mistake, she needed to be looking straight ahead. You were brought to this pack as a stranger, Eli continued. You were given shelter, given a home, given every opportunity to prove your worth. And while we acknowledge the healing knowledge you carry a slight pause, a concession he was clearly making against some internal resistance, we cannot overlook what you lack. You carry no wolf, you bear no bond to this pack through blood or mate, you are a liability we can no longer afford. Liability. She heard his oldest voice in her memory, unbidden. They say words like that when they're afraid, little bird. It means they can feel something they don't understand. Isolda had been dead for 7 months and Norah still heard her constantly. You are to take what belongs to you and be beyond our border by the time the moon is overhead. Eli's voice was not unkind, it was simply final. This is not punishment, it is a parting as though she were a guest who had stayed too long at a dinner table. There was movement at the edge of the crowd. Then a disruption, a voice cutting through, and she knew before she even turned that it was Jonah. Of course it was Jonah. He was pushing forward through the gathered wolves with the particular expression he wore when he had made a decision that he knew was going to cost him something and had decided to pay it anyway. This is wrong, he said loudly enough that the crowd shifted. You all know it's wrong. She has healed every one of you. She has never once asked for anything in return. Jonah. Eli's voice was a wall. She deserves to be heard. Jonah. The alpha's tone dropped a register carrying the particular harmonic of dominant command that moved through a wolf's chest like a hand closing around the heart. Jonah stopped speaking. His jaw clenched. His hands had curled into fists at his sides, and his eyes found hers across the crowd, brown and furious and full of something that had always been too complicated for either of them to name. She gave him the smallest shake of her head. Don't. It won't change anything, and it will cost you everything. He understood. She watched him understand and hate understanding. And he went still. Norah turned back to the alpha. All right, she said. The same 2 words, the only 2 words there were. She walked back to Isolde's cabin. Her cabin now, though, not for much longer. And she took what was hers, a worn leather satchel, the herb journals, Isolde's handwriting filling the margins in her cramped, careful script, a change of clothes, the small carved wooden fox that Isolda had pressed into her hands on her 20th birthday, saying, I found this the day I found you, little bird. I think it belongs with you. She pressed her thumb against its smooth head and then tucked it deep into the satchel where nothing could reach it. Fine, she did not look at the cabin. She would not look at it. She had done her grieving for this place already 7 months ago. Standing in a room that still smelled of as old as herbs and realizing that without that woman she had no anchor in this world. She had known then that the pack would move quickly. She had simply hoped stupidly, and despite all available evidence that she was wrong. She walked out into the rain and did not look back. The beginning of the story as Norah understood it was not the banishment. It was not even the years of hostility or the power that had started opening inside her like a cracked fault line at 20 years old. The beginning was a woman walking alone in a forest in the early morning, her basket over her arm, her mind on the properties of dried arrowroot. Isolda had been the pack's healer for 30 years when she found Norah. She had walked into those woods the way she did most mornings, following the paths she had worn into them over 3 decades, knowing every tree by the quality of light it let through its canopy, knowing every clearing by what grew in it and why. She was 61 years old and had buried a husband and had grown accustomed with the particular dignity of someone who has genuinely tried to make peace with their grief to the shape of a life that would not include children. The crying stopped her 20 yards from the eastern streambed. She stood and listened because her first thought was bird, and her second thought was that no bird she knew made a sound quite like that. Then she set down her basket and walked toward it, parting the undergrowth with both hands, and found the baby wrapped in cloth that had once been fine and was now soaked through with forest damp and morning cold, tucked into the roots of an old oak with the specific placement of someone who had meant to come back and hadn't. Isa crouched down. She looked at the baby for a long moment. The baby stopped crying and looked back at her with dark, serious eyes. Well, Isolda said, here you are. She gathered the baby up, cloth and all, and held her against her chest until the shivering stopped. She brought her back to the settlement and told the pack what she had found, and the pack's response was immediate and unanimous and entirely predictable. This was not their problem. A stray infant from no known bloodline, no wolf scent, no pack mark. She was nothing. She belonged to no one. The elders argued that leaving her in the forest had been a kinder fate than the complications of raising an outsider within the pack structure. Isolda listened to all of it and then went to Alpha Eli's father, who was the Alpha then, and laid before him 30 years of service without complaint. 30 years of healing their sick and their injured and their dying with skill and care and never once seeking recognition. And she asked for one thing in return. He gave it to her. The pack accepted Norah the way you accept a stone in your shoe, aware of it, uncomfortable, occasionally making their displeasure known. But Isolda was not a woman who required the world to cooperate with her in order to proceed. She built a life for the child with what she had, which was considerable. She taught Norah to read by firelight using the old healing journals. She taught her the names of 200 herbs and roots and barks by the time she was 8, their properties and preparations and the specific conditions each one addressed. She taught her to move through the forest without disturbing it, to listen with more than her ears, to trust her hands when they told her something that her eyes couldn't confirm. She taught her, most importantly, that her worth was not determined by the opinion of people who had already decided not to see her. They will tell you what you are not. Isolda said to her once sitting by the fire while the rain fell outside. They will say it often and with great confidence. Your only job is to know the difference between what they see and what is true. Norah had been 12 years old. She had stored the words somewhere central where she could reach them quickly. She needed them often. The pack's hostility was not dramatic. It was the ordinary, grinding kind that wears a person down through accumulation. Small exclusions, cold silences, conversations that stopped when she entered a room, invitations that were never extended, the particular quality of space people make around something they consider beneath their notice. She was Isolda's girl, strange Isolda's strange foundling. She moved through the pack's daily life like weather present and unavoidable but not truly attended to. There were 2 exceptions. The first was Olivia, who had arrived into Norah's life at 15 when she fell out of a tree in front of his oldest cabin and broke her wrist in 2 places, and who had subsequently appeared again the following week to say thank you, and then again the week after that with no stated reason, and eventually had simply become a fixture. Olivia was bright and social and deeply embedded in the pack's central life in all the ways Norah was not, and she had made the calculation early that their friendship needed to exist in a particular way, not hidden exactly, but not announced. She came to Norah's door in the evenings. She did not sit with her in the common hall. She did not defend her in open company. Norah had accepted this with the same clear eyes she accepted most things, because having Olivia in this specific limited way was better than not having her at all, and she had learned not to ask the world for more than it was offering. The second exception was Jonah, who had no calculation about him whatsoever. He was 2 years older than Norah, a mid-ranked warrior with a broad frame and a habit of saying exactly what he thought in situations where silence would have served him better. He had started sitting beside her at the few communal meals she was required to attend when he was 17 and she was 15. Not because anyone suggested it, but because he had looked at the way the space around her worked and found it offensive. He was bullied for it periodically and without much creativity by the pack members who felt his association with her required correction. He bore this with a flat, not unimpressed expression that communicated his opinion of their efforts without requiring him to say anything. He had never told her how he felt. She had chosen not to look at it directly. Some things were easier to have when they remained unnamed. She was 20 years old when the power started. It came the way she imagined a river comes when a dam breaks, not gradually, but all at once in a surge that had force behind it from all the years of pressure that preceded it. She woke one night in a cold sweat with her hands burning and the smell of something ancient and clean filling the cabin like lightning before it strikes. She sat up in her bed and there was light between her fingers. Pale silver white, casting no shadows, or rather casting shadows that went in the wrong direction. She sat with it for a long time. Then she closed her hands and it went out. She told Isolda in the morning she showed her. Isolda watched with an expression that moved through several rooms. Surprise, then recognition, then something that looked like awe settled into sorrow. Your mother, Isolde said finally. Whoever she was not Wolf. No, Norah agreed. This is going to be complicated. Yes. Isolda looked at her hands for a moment, then she looked at Norah. We tell no one. It was also around this time that the attacks began. They came to her first as visions arriving in the space between sleep and waking impressions more than images. Feelings with shape. She saw darkness moving through forest. She felt cold that was not weather pressure, that was not wind, a force that traveled through the land itself and hit living things like a blow to the chest. She felt it connect with wolves. Felt the moment of impact, the way a body registers something it has no framework to survive. She woke from these visions gasping with the taste of iron in her mouth and the burning in her hands already beginning. Word reached Starfall in pieces. A pack to the east had lost 6 members in a single night to something no one could name. A pack to the north reported their crops failing, their wolves falling sick in patterns that didn't follow any illness Norah had in her journals. A pack to the west went quiet entirely. The elders said it was distance. They said Starfall was protected. They said whatever was happening to other packs was the consequence of weak alphas and poor preparation. Norah lay awake 3 nights running after the first Eastern report. her hands burning the pressure building in her chest. And she understood in the way her gift gave her understanding not through reasoning but through contact, the way you understand cold by touching it, that it was coming here. It was already moving, and no alpha's strength or pack's preparation would have any effect on it whatsoever. She got up in the dark, she went out into the trees, and she did the only thing she could think to do. She built a wall. She had no name for what she made. It unfolded from her hands like light and heat and intention all woven together, pressing outward through the trees until it found the border of Starfall's territory and followed it, sealing itself along the pack's perimeter the way water finds and fills a crack. She felt the moment it completed a sensation like a deep breath, like the click of a lock turning. She felt the territory inside it settle safe, contained. Then the world tilted and she went down on her hands and knees in the dirt and her vision went to white. And by the time she'd pulled herself back to something like upright, she was shaking from her spine outward and her nose was bleeding freely into the forest floor. She lay there until she could stand. Then she walked back to the cabin and fell into bed and slept for 16 hours. Isolda found her and drew her own conclusions and said nothing to anyone. She restocked her healing cabinet. She began keeping certain teas already brewed. She watched Norah with quiet, careful eyes, and when Norah came to her weeks later after the second vision, after the second barrier, after waking on the forest floor with both hands numb and blood on her lip, Isolda simply took her face in her warm, dry hands and said, "You are the most remarkable thing I have ever found, little bird, and I would rather you were ordinary and safe." "I can't stop," Norah said. "I know." Isolda tucked her into bed the way she had when Norah was 7 years old and frightened of the dark. "I know you can't." The barriers cost her more each time. She grew thinner. She moved through some weeks as though the air had weight, her body marshalling its resources around some invisible central wound. The pack saw her sickness and called it weakness. She heard them say so. She let them say it. Isolda would careful stories around her most severe episodes. A bad season, a recurring illness, nothing contagious, nothing to concern yourself with. The pack was satisfied to have an explanation that confirmed what they already believed, that Norah was fragile, that she was a drain. She cast 6 barriers over 3 years, and the pack lost no one to the attacks that were emptying the territories around them. When Isolda died quietly in the early morning with her hand in Norah's and no drama about it, which was entirely in character, the pack waited less than a month before the conversations began in earnest. Norah heard them through walls. She heard them at a distance when people forgot to lower their voices. She heard them in the quality of silence she received when she entered rooms. She kept doing the work. She kept healing whoever came to her door, which they still did because whatever they thought of her own, they were not foolish enough to stop using a healer when they needed one. She kept building the barriers. She fell further, each time recovered slower. One morning, after the 5th barrier, she woke on the forest floor at noon with no memory of how long she had been there with frost in her hair and both hands dark with cold. And she lay staring up through the canopy and thought with perfect clarity, "I cannot do this much longer." She hauled herself upright, she went home, she made her tea, she did not stop. The vote happened on a Tuesday. She knew about it before it was called, the way she always knew things through the particular texture of the air around her, the way gazes slid off her in the common spaces, and the way even the few neutral pack members had started treating her with the careful distance of people who were preparing to have clean hands. When Eli summoned her to the courtyard, she was already dressed. She stood through it. She watched Olivia look at the ground. She watched Jonah be silenced. She said all right and turned and walked. She had made it to the edge of the tree, the rain coming down properly, now her satchel on her back, and as old as fox against her ribs when she felt it. The vision came without warning, not sleep this time, just a wall of sensation hitting her full in the chest, stopping her feet. She saw it, the dark force moving closer than it had ever been. Faster bearing down on Starfall's border with a pressure that meant it had learned something had grown but had found a gap or a weakness or simply accumulated enough force to try again. She stood at the edge of the forest in the rain. Behind her was a pack that had just thrown her out. Ahead of her was nothing. Nowhere. A dark road and an unknown world and the complete freedom of someone who has been cut entirely loose. She thought of Isolda. Not the end of her, not the morning with the hand in hers, but earlier. Isolda at the fire, Isolda in the garden, Isolda pressing seeds into soil with a patience that never seemed to cost her anything. You give because it is who you are. Isolda had told her once, not because of who receives it. Norah set down her satchel. She pressed her burning hands against the earth. She built the barrier. This time she built it differently, deeper, anchored further down, all woven into the roots of the territory itself rather than just along its surface. Because she could feel the weight of what was coming, and she wanted this one to hold. She wanted it to hold long after she was gone. She fed it everything, every reserve she had, every threat of strength she'd spent 3 years carefully hoarding. She fed it the grief of losing Isolda, and the grief of losing Olivia's courage, and the grief of watching Jonah be silenced, and the grief of every meal eaten alone, every door that had been closed. Every morning she had woken up inside this pack's borders and felt the specific ache of being surrounded by people and not belonging to any of them. She fed it all of it. She built the strongest barrier she had ever made. And when it was done, when she felt it seal itself and settle and hold, when she felt the dark force hit it and fail, she felt herself go out like a candle. She was on her back on the cold ground before she knew she was falling. The rain fell on her face and she could not move, and the trees above her were going in and out of focus, the branches blurring at their edges. She was aware distantly of her hands lying open beside her, the light gone out of them. She was aware of the cold entering her from the ground up, moving through her, the way water moves through cloth. Isolda, she thought, with what seemed like the last thought-shaped thing in her. I think I'm done. The rain fell, the forest was very dark, and somewhere behind her, warm inside the barrier she had just built with the last of herself. The Starfall Pack slept on unknowing and unharmed. Norah lay still in the mud, and the cold closed over her like a hand. Jonah left on the second night. He had lasted longer than he expected. He had stood in that courtyard and watched her walk away and told himself it was done, that she was gone, that the pack's decision had been made and there was nothing left for him to do but accept it, the way he had accepted every other thing in his life that he had no power to change. He had gone back to his quarters and sat on the edge of his bed in the dark and waited for the feeling to settle. It did not settle. He kept seeing her face in the moment before she turned. The way she had looked at him when he tried to speak. That small, precise shake of her head that said, "Don't. It won't help," and the terrible calm in it. Not resignation. Something older and more deliberate than resignation. The look of someone who had spent years practicing the art of receiving blows without flinching, who had gotten so skilled at it that it had become its own kind of dignity. He thought about Isolda, about the way the old healer had looked at Norah when she thought no one was watching, with a specific luminous pride, the kind a person carries for something they consider their finest work. He thought about the years Norah had spent in that cabin after Isolda died, alone, continuing the work because the work was what Isolda had given her and she did not know how to put it down. He thought about the sickness, the way it had cycled through her for 3 years, appearing without clear cause and retreating without explanation, leaving her thinner each time, quieter, more careful about how she used her energy. He had never understood it. He had only known that it frightened him in a way he had never been able to say out loud. On the second night, he stopped trying to settle and went to the stables instead. He told himself he would simply follow her trail far enough to confirm she had found shelter. He told himself this even as he packed provisions for 4 days. He told himself this as he saddled his horse in the dark. As he moved quietly through the sleeping settlement and out past the eastern gate, following the path she would have taken into the trees. He was a tracker by training. Following her trail should have been straightforward. What he had not accounted for was the rain which had been falling since the night of the banishment and had flattened and blurred the ground, unwashing soft soil back over footprints and beating down the grass that would otherwise have shown the pressure of someone's passing. He found traces, a partial print in the mud near the tree's edge, a broken twig at the height of a satchel's swing, but they were sparse and the forest was wide and the dark between the trees was absolute. He searched through the rest of that night and all of the following day, moving and expanding arcs from the last trace he'd found, reading the forest with the systematic patience of someone who knows that the alternative to patience is failure. The rain did not stop. He was wet through within the first hour and remained wet through. His horse blowing clouds of breath into the cold air, the forest around them dripping and gray and utterly indifferent. He found her near sunset on the second day. She was 50 yards from the main path in a shallow depression between 2 roots of an ancient oak, and she was so still and so pale in the gray light that he was off his horse before it had properly stopped moving, sliding down into the mud on both knees beside her. He pressed 2 fingers to her throat with hands that were not entirely steady and found her pulse. Their present thin as a thread, pulled too tight but unbroken. "Norah," he said her name like it was a door he was knocking on. "Norah, can you hear me?" "Nothing." Her face was the color of birch bark. Her lips had a bluish cast at the edges that he recognized with cold clarity from battlefield wounds, from the look of a body that had been giving and giving until there was simply nothing left to give. Her hands lying open beside her. These were serrated at the palms where she had gone down on them, the cuts filled with dirt and beginning to close in the slow, uncertain way of a body that was trying to heal with insufficient resources. He took his outer coat and wrapped her in it. Then he lifted her. She weighed almost nothing, which hid him somewhere deep and wordless, and he settled her against him on the horse, her head against his chest, and he rode. He rode through the night without stopping his horse, finding the path by the particular instinct that horses develop when they understand that urgency is genuine. He held Norah against him and felt the shallow movement of her breathing and kept his eyes on the dark ahead and did not allow himself to think about the possibility that the breathing would stop. He aimed for the Kale settlement 2 hours south at speed, where he knew a healer practiced who had trained under a tradition different from his oldest. Older methods, broader knowledge. He had no idea if broader knowledge would be sufficient for whatever this was. He went anyway. The Kale settlement was awake when he arrived, which surprised him until he saw why. They had suffered recently. It was visible in the settlement, the way damage is visible in a face, in the gaps in the places where things had been and were no longer. Buildings with doors standing open and cold hearths inside. A communal fire that was tended by fewer people than the size of the space suggested it should be. Children sitting too close to adults with the specific posture of children who have recently been frightened and have not yet been fully convinced the frightening is over. The people who came out to meet him at the gate had the careful eyes of a community that had learned to assess threat quickly because it could not afford to be slow. "I need your healer," he said. "Please, she's a woman," was already moving toward him before he finished. A small, compact figure with silver-streaked hair and the brisk, assessing manner of someone whose competence had been tested recently and had held. She looked at Norah in his arms, and her expression shifted into the focused neutrality of a healer working. "Bring her inside," she said. "Now." Her name was Petra. She worked on Norah for 3 hours in a low-ceiling room that smelled of dried herbs and wood smoke, while Jonah sat on a bench outside the door and stared at his own hands. A Kale elder, a man with a quiet face and careful speech, brought him something hot to drink and sat beside him without asking. "She your mate?" the man asked. Jonah looked at the door. "No, but not nothing either." He didn't answer. The elder nodded as though he had. Inside the room, Norah hovered in the space between. She was not entirely unconscious. She moved through something that had light in it, a quality of warmth, a sense of presence that felt familiar in a way she couldn't locate. She thought she smelled yarrow. She thought she heard at a great distance a voice she recognized in her bones saying, "Not yet," little bird, in a tone that was both instruction and endearment. Then Petra's sharp, certain voice cut through. "There you are. Come back then. Come on." She came back. Waking was gradual and then all at once. Darkness, then gray, dining, then the specific texture of rough, woven linen under her cheek and the smell of the room pressing in. She opened her eyes to low firelight, and Petra sitting back in her chair with the expression of someone who has completed a demanding piece of work and is taking a moment before the next thing. "You were very nearly gone," Petra said. It was not said with drama, just information. "I know," Norah said. Her voice came out barely above a whisper. "Whatever you did, whatever you used this body for, it was beyond what a body is meant to sustain." Petra leaned forward, resting her forearms on her knees. "I've treated exhaustion. I've treated power sickness in wolves who pushed their shifts too far. I've treated starvation and exposure. This was all of those things at once, and then something underneath all of them that I don't have a clean name for." She paused. "I am not asking you to explain it. I am telling you what I found so you understand the size of what you survived." Norah was quiet for a moment. Through the wall, she could hear the low sounds of the settlement, voices, a child calling out the distant pop of a fire. "How long?" she asked. 3 days since the young man brought you in." 3 days. She pressed her hand flat against the blanket and concentrated on the sensation of the texture against her palm, the solidity of it. She was here. She was breathing. The barrier had held. She could feel that it had held the way she could always feel its presence after she built it. A quiet hum at the edge of her awareness like a sustained note. Still standing, still sealed. "There is someone waiting," Petra said with what might have been the faintest trace of dry amusement. "He has been waiting since he arrived. He has slept approximately 4 hours in 3 days, from what I can tell, despite being told repeatedly that he could do nothing useful by remaining awake. The door opened before she could respond, and Jonah filled the frame, taking in the sight of her open eyes with an expression that he almost managed to control before it became fully visible. Almost. She saw it, the relief moving through him like a wave breaking, loosening something in his face that had been very tightly held. He crossed the room and sat in the chair Petra had vacated. He looked at her for a moment without speaking. "You left without me," he said finally. "You weren't invited," she said. "I'm aware." He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. He had the hollowed look of someone who had not slept or eaten properly in days, and there was mud still in the crease of his collar that he'd missed when washing. "Norah, what happened to you out there?" She looked at the ceiling. Outside, the child's voice called again and was answered. "I built something," she said. "I've been building it for a while. This one I built larger than the others." She paused. "I didn't plan to survive it." The silence that followed had weight. "What do you mean you didn't plan?" he started. "I didn't mean it that way," she said quickly, turning her head to look at him. "I didn't choose it. I simply ran out. I knew it was likely, and I did it anyway." She held his eyes. "I needed it to hold." He looked at her for a long time. Then he sat back and looked at the wall and breathed through whatever that had done to him. She watched it happen and felt in some tired, grateful part of herself something like tenderness. They stayed with the Kale Pack. There was nowhere else to go, and the Kale people, despite their own recent losses, opened what they had with the particular generosity of people who have learned that closed hands in hard times only makes the hard times worse. They were given a small, shared cabin at the settlement's edge with a woodpile outside and 2 narrow beds and a window that looked out on the common path. Jonah chopped wood and helped with repair work, paying for their keep with his hands because it was what he had. Norah, when she could sit upright, began helping Petra. She saw the settlement clearly as her strength returned. She saw the gaps where people had been. She saw the way the pack's members moved in the evening, close together, never comfortable, always with one ear turned outward toward the dark. She listened to what wasn't said in conversations that stopped when she entered rooms, not from hostility this time, but from the habitual caution of people managing a shared wound they hadn't finished bleeding from yet. She asked Petra one evening while they sorted dried stores together what had happened. Petra was quiet for a moment. "Something comes," she said, "through the territory. Not like any predator or sickness I've known, it moves through the ground, through the air, and when it hits." She pressed her lips together. "There is no fighting it, there is no preparing for it. It comes and it takes and it goes, and we bury the ones it leaves behind." She looked at Norah. "We lost 19 people in the last 3 months." Norah set down the bundle in her hands. 19. She thought of her own pack, she thought of the barriers she had built, of the attacks she had felt coming, and turned back of the lives inside those borders who had eaten their meals and slept in their beds and argued with their neighbors without ever knowing the force that had moved through the dark toward them and found a wall. That night she lay awake and thought about the children she had seen here. A girl of about 6 who had attached herself to Jonah with the uncomplicated devotion of small children for large, gentle people. A set of twin boys who still flinched at loud sounds. A mother who held her infant with an intensity that went beyond ordinary love into something more like desperate maintenance. She thought about what it meant to live without the walls she had learned to build, to simply absorb each blow as it came and keep trying to stand after it. She thought about Isolda. You give because it is who you are, not because of who receives it. She made her decision quietly in the dark without drama. When the attack came 4 days later, she was ready. She had felt it building for 2 days. The familiar pressure in the air, the quality of the dark changing outside the cabin window, the way the forest at the settlement's edge had gone silent in the particular way that meant something was moving through it that the birds and animals had decided to vacate their opinions about. She had said nothing to Jonah because she needed him calm. She had spent those 2 days eating everything Petra put in front of her and sleeping as many hours as her body would accept storing up. She was not at full strength, she was not close, but she was enough. On the morning of the 4th day, she walked out of the cabin before dawn and went to stand at the settlement's edge at the place where the tree line thinned and the territory opened, and she pressed her palms against the earth and she waited. And Jonah found her there within minutes. She heard him come up behind her and stop. "What are you doing?" he asked quietly. In a moment, she said, "Step back." He stepped back. She heard it coming, felt it rather in the soles of her feet and the burning in her hands and the way the air pressure shifted around the settlement's border. She took a breath. She opened her hands. The light came up through her like water rising pale silver white, finding the edges of the territory and following them outward, building itself into the shape she had learned to make. the wall that held against what walls weren't supposed to stop. She heard Jonah make a sound behind her that she had no category for. The barrier sealed. The force hit it. She felt the impact travel through her like a struck bell, vibrating through every bone from her hands to her spine. And she locked her legs and kept her feet and stayed upright, barely by the width of a held breath, but upright. And then it passed. The dark pressure receded. The birds came back to the trees. The air returned to being ordinary cold morning air, the kind that smelled of pine resin and damp earth and nothing else. Norah lowered her hands. The light faded. She became aware with clinical interest that her legs were shaking. She sat down deliberately before they made the choice for her, folding onto the ground with what she intended to be controlled and what probably looked like a slow collapse. Jonah was beside her before she'd finished sitting. His hands found her shoulders, steadied her. She could feel the shock still moving through him. The way he was simultaneously trying to hold her up and process what he had just seen around them. The settlement was stirring. People had come out of their doors. They stood in the gray early light, staring at the faint residual shimmer at the tree's edge, at Norah sitting in the dirt with the dawn on her face, at their own hands and their own standing bodies alive and unharmed. What was that someone said from somewhere behind her? She didn't answer. She was watching Jonah's face. He was looking at her with something that had moved beyond shock into a different country entirely, a hard, quiet reckoning. The expression of someone rearranging everything they thought they understood. She watched it happen. She watched him think through it. She watched the moment the understanding arrived. The sickness, he said. His voice was very low. All those years, every time he stopped, his jaw worked. You were doing this for Starfall. You were doing this the whole time, and that's what was making you sick. She held his eyes and didn't deny it. They called you a burden, he said. Yes. He looked at her for a long moment with something in his face she had never let herself look at directly before. Then he looked away at the tree-line, at the place where the barrier had held and the force had turned back, and he breathed in slowly through his nose and out through his mouth. They don't know, he said. It was not a question. No, they never knew. No. The settlement was very quiet around them. Petra had come out of her cabin and was standing a few feet away with her arms folded, watching Norah with the expression of someone who has received a very large answer to a very long-standing question. The Kale people gathered slowly, drawn from their doors by the stillness where there should have been devastation. They stood in a loose circle and looked at each other, and then at the woman sitting in the dirt at the edge of their territory, spent and pale and utterly calm. It was the elder who had sat with Jonah on the bench outside the healer's door who spoke first. He walked forward through the gathered pack until he was standing directly in front of Norah, and he looked down at her for a moment, and then with the gravity of someone who understands the weight of gestures, he lowered himself to one knee. "What is your name?" he asked. She looked at him. Norah. Norah. He said it as though he were learning it. "My pack owes you a debt." She shook her head. "You owe me nothing. You gave me shelter when I had none. We're even." Behind her, she felt Jonah's hand settle between her shoulder blades, warm and steady and entirely deliberate. She didn't move away from it. Later, when she had eaten and rested, and the settlement had returned to its cautious daily rhythms, Petra came and sat beside her by the fire with the particular manner of someone who has been thinking carefully about what they want to say. "The barrier," Petra said. "How long will it hold?" Norah considered. "Longer than the others I've made. I built it deeper," she paused, "but not forever." Petra nodded. Then after a moment, "The one you built for your last pack, the large one, the final one." She looked at Norah directly. How long? Norah stared into the fire. The wood cracked and shifted, sending up a small constellation of sparks. "Not long enough," she said quietly. The fire burned down. Outside, somewhere across the settlement, the little girl who had attached herself to Jonah was singing something tuneless and cheerful to herself, the sound carrying cleanly on the cold air. Norah listened to it. She thought about the walls she had built and the ones she had left behind and the people sleeping inside them who did not know what kept the dark at bay. She thought about what it would mean when those walls came down. The answer, when it came to her, arrived not as a thought but as a sensation. The particular pull she felt when her gift was trying to show her something she needed to know. She closed her eyes. In the vision, she saw Starfall, and Starfall was burning. The first survivors arrived 3 days after the vision. Norah was at the settlement's edge when they came through the trees. A small group, 7 of them, moving with the particular gait of people who had been walking for a long time and were no longer certain their bodies would carry them much further. She recognized 2 of them before they were close enough to speak. A warrior named Devanin who had never said a word to her that wasn't a dismissal. An elder woman, Bryn, who had voted at the reckoning with her chin raised and her eyes flat. They saw her at the same moment she saw them. Davin stopped walking. Something moved through his face. Recognition, then confusion, then a complicated collapse of expression that had shame somewhere inside it. Bryn went very still. Norah looked at them for a long moment, and then she turned to the Kale gatekeeper beside her. "Let them in," she said. "You know them?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "Let them in." She did not go to meet them. She walked back toward the settlement center and left the gate open behind her because a door held open is not the same as an embrace, and she was not ready for an embrace. She was not certain she would ever be ready for that, but she could open a door. Isolda had taught her that much. More came over the following days in 2s and 3s, and once in a group of 11, emerging from the forest with the hollowed eyes and urgent bodies of people who have left everything behind them and are not yet sure what lies ahead. Norah watched them come and directed them to food and warmth and rest without ceremony. She did not make speeches. She did not make them account for themselves. She simply watched the Kale people absorb the newcomers with the same open-handed generosity they had shown her. And she felt something move through her chest that was not quite forgiveness and not quite grief, but contained elements of both. Jonah watched her do this with careful eyes. He said nothing about it, which she appreciated. He simply remained close, not hovering, not pressing, just present in the steady, undemanding way that had always been his particular gift. He had taken to sitting with her in the evenings by the common fire close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, and she had taken to not moving away. It was on the 5th day that Olivia came. Norah felt her before she saw her, felt the specific quality of her presence. The way you feel weather changing a shift in the atmosphere that her body had been calibrated to recognize for over a decade. She was sorting dried stores with Petra in the supply cabin when she felt it, and she set down the bundle in her hands and was still for a moment. "Go," Petra said without looking up. She found Olivia just inside the settlement gate, standing slightly apart from the group she had arrived with, her arms wrapped around herself. She looked diminished. That was the only word Norah had for it. Olivia, who had always moved through the world with the ease of someone fully at home in it, looked as though the world had recently demonstrated that it could not be trusted, and she had not yet worked out what to do with that information. She looked up and saw Norah, and her face broke open. Aunt Norah stood still and watched it happen. Watched Olivia's careful composure come apart in layers the way it does when you have been holding yourself together through necessity. And then suddenly the person you most needed to see is standing in front of you and the necessity evaporates. Her eyes filled, her jaw worked. "Norah," she said. Her voice was barely there. Norah looked at her oldest friend, at the face she had known since childhood that had been present for every significant thing in her life, both good and unbearable. She looked at the guilt that lived in Olivia's eyes now. Not fresh guilt. Not the guilt of someone who had just done something wrong, but the worn, seasoned kind that had been carried for a long time. She had imagined this moment in the abstract during the long evenings of the past weeks. She had imagined anger, and she had thought there might be anger, but standing here now, looking at Olivia's broken face, she found something quieter and more complicated than anger. She found a sorrow that had already done most of its work. "Come inside," she said. "You need to eat." "Norah." "I come inside first." She brought her to the small cabin she shared with Jonah, sat her down beside the fire, put food in front of her, and waited while she ate with the mechanical focus of someone running on empty. When the plate was finished and Olivia had wrapped both hands around a cup of something hot and was staring into it, Norah sat across from her and waited. "I knew it was wrong," Olivia said to the cup. "I stood there and I watched and I knew." She pressed her lips together. "I told myself it was the pack, that the pack's decision had to come before." She stopped, started again. "I told myself a lot of things." "I know," Norah said. "I saw your face when you looked at me." Olivia's voice fractured on the last word. "I know you saw it. The guilt. I couldn't. I wasn't brave enough to." She set the cup down. Her hands were shaking. "Eli is dead, 6 of the elders who voted. Davin lost his mate and both his children." Her voice had gone very flat, the way voices go when the facts being recounted are too large to be carried by ordinary tone. We didn't understand what was happening. There was nothing to prepare for it, no warning, no pattern we could read. It came and it came and it came, and there was nothing. She stopped. Pressed the back of her hand against her mouth for a moment. Other packs had been living with it for years. We thought we were different. We thought we were protected somehow. She laughed, a short, hollow sound. We never even asked why. The fire cracked outside. The settlement moved through its evening rhythms. "Unforgivable," Norah said quietly. She was not talking about the attacks. Olivia looked up. She understood. Her eyes went very bright. Norah was quiet for a moment. She looked at the fire. She thought about Isolda. Not for the first time today, not for the last time today. Because Isolda had become the fixed point she returned to when she needed to know which direction to go. She thought about what Isolda had said about forgiveness once years ago when Norah had come home from a particularly brutal day and sat at the table and asked, with the blunt honesty of a 14-year-old who had not yet learned to soften her questions. Does it ever stop hurting being on the outside of things? Isolda had looked at her for a long time before answering. The hurt changes, she had said finally. If you let it, it can become something that reminds you of your own strength rather than their cruelty. But you have to choose that. No one can do the choosing for you. Norah looked back at Olivia. What you did hurt me, she said. It came out steady and clear the way hard truths do when they have been held long enough to lose their jagged edges. Not just that night, years of it. I understood why you made the choices you made, and I made my peace with them, and they hurt anyway. I need you to know that. Olivia nodded. Her eyes were very bright, and I am not what I was to you before. Norah continued. That version of our friendship, the one that lived in secret that I accepted because any version of you was better than none. I can't go back to that, she paused. I won't. I know, Olivia whispered. I don't expect I'm not asking for— She stopped, gathered herself. I'm not asking for anything, Norah. I just needed you to know that I'm sorry that I know what I did, that I would undo it if— Her voice broke entirely. Norah looked at her for a long moment, then she leaned forward and covered Olivia's shaking hands with her own. We can be something new, she said quietly. I don't know yet what that looks like, but I am not going to turn you away. She let that sit for a moment. That's what I have right now. It's not everything, but it's real. Olivia looked down at their joined hands and breathed in long and unsteady and breathed out. It's enough, she said. It's more than enough. 3 nights later, she woke before dawn with her hands already burning. Not the urgent reactive burn of a threat approaching. Something different, something that came from inside rather than from outside, a deep, insistent pull. The way a hunger is different from a wound. She lay still for a moment, she reading it. The Kale barrier was holding. She could feel it the way she always felt her work after it was done. A quiet hum at the edges of her awareness, steady and untroubled. But steady was not the same as strong. It was the barrier she had built in the early weeks of her arrival when she was still recovering, still running on gratitude and the first fragile warmth of belonging. She had built it with what she had. What she had then had not been enough. She sat up in the dark and looked at her hands. The silver-white light was already gathering softly between her fingers, restless and waiting, the way it always was when the gift had decided something before she had consciously caught up to it. She thought about Lena asleep somewhere across the settlement, the twin boys, the mother, and her infant. She thought about the Kyle elder's knee on the frozen ground. She thought about what it meant to have been given unconditional things for the first time since Isolda, to have been received not as a burden to be managed or a problem to be solved, but simply as a person worth saving. She thought about how it had felt to walk through this settlement in her first days here and feel the quality of the welcome, how it had moved into the hollow places inside her and begun slowly to fill them. These people deserved more than a barrier built by a half-dead woman on borrowed strength. They deserved everything she had now, all of it, built properly from the ground up, anchored in something that would last. She got up. She sat there until the gray before dawn began at the window. Then she got up. Jonah was awake when she came out of her room, sitting at the table in the way she had learned he sat when he had been awake for a while and was not going to admit it. He looked at her hands, at the faint light already gathering there. The silver white she could never fully suppress when it was building, and his expression settled into the careful steadiness she had come to rely on. Tell me, he said. She told him not about Starfall, that she kept folded quietly back into herself where it belonged. She told him about the Kale barrier, about the one she had built in the urgent dark of her first week here when she was still half broken and running on borrowed strength. It was holding, but it was not what it could be. These people had given her everything they had when she had nothing, who had opened their stores and their fire and their small spaces without question, had looked at a stranger barely alive and decided she was worth saving. Lena had given her her best drawings. Petra had not slept the first 3 nights. The elder had sat outside a door for 3 days with a man he did not know because that man needed someone beside him. She had never been given unconditional things before, not since Isolda. And she understood now, sitting in the dim cabin with her hands beginning to glow and Jonah watching her with his steady brown eyes, that this was what Isolda had always meant about love being an anchor, not a comfort, an anchor, the thing that holds you in place when you are about to be swept away by the size of what you are attempting. These people were her anchor, and she was going to build them something that would last. I want to make it deeper, she told Jonah, stronger than anything I've done before. Not because I'm afraid, but because they deserve it. She paused. They are my people now. This is what I can give them. He was quiet for a moment, his jaw was tight in the way it got when he was managing something. Will it hurt you? He asked. Less than the last time, she said. I'm not empty going into it. I'm not desperate. She searched for the word. I'm full. For the first time in a long time, he looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at her hands, at the light between her fingers, and something in his face settled into a kind of wonder that he didn't try to hide. What do you need from me? He asked. Something loosened in her chest. Stay with me while I do it, she said. If I start to fall, pull me back, he nodded. When dawn, she said. When the light comes. She spent the remaining dark hours with Petra preparing. She ate. She drank everything Petra gave her without question. She let the healer press her palms and check her pulse and assess her reserves with the brisk efficiency of a woman running calculations on a margin that needed to be as wide as possible. Petra said nothing encouraging, which was its own kind of encouragement. False reassurance would have been worse. At dawn, she walked to the settlement center. The eastern sky was pale gold and rose the frost on the grass, catching the early light and holding it like something cupped. The settlement was waking, she could hear it, the ordinary sounds of morning. You see people moving toward their day with the cautious normally of those who have been recently reminded how precious ordinary days are. She had told Jonah to say nothing, but people had gathered anyway, the way they do when something in the air communicates that what is about to happen is worth witnessing. She saw Petra at the edge of the circle, the Kale elder with his hands folded. Lena held in her mother's arms, watching with the open, unguarded attention of the very young. She saw Olivia standing at the back of the gathering with Davin beside her, neither of them knowing fully why they had come out, only that something had pulled them. Norah stood in the center of them all and pressed her bare feet against the cold earth. She felt its depth beneath her down through the frost layer and the soil and the deep root threaded dark below that all the way to the bedrock where things last. She felt the Kale territory around her, its familiar edges, and the people gathered inside it. She thought of Lena's drawings pressed into her hands. She thought of the Allers' knee on the frozen ground. She thought of Petra's 3 sleepless nights. She thought of Jonah riding through rain for 2 days, not because she had asked him to, but because he could not do otherwise. She let all of it in every piece of unconditional, unearned, freely given thing. She let it fill the spaces that years of rejection had carved hollow. Then she opened her hands. The light came up slowly, measured and deep, nothing like the desperate surge of the barriers she had built before. It moved out from her palms in long, steady waves, finding the earth and flowing through it the way a river finds its bed, following the root systems outward, spreading through this Kale territory with a patience she had never been able to afford before. She felt it reach the settlement's border and press further, anchoring itself into the ground with a permanence that previous barriers had never had. Not built on urgency, built on something solid, built on love, which turned out to be the strongest foundation she had ever worked with. She felt it go deep, deeper than anything she had made, down through the frost, down through the soil, down into the bedrock, where it seated itself like something that had always been there and was only now being recognized. She sealed it. She felt it complete. Not with a click, but with a long resonance settling like a great bell after it has been struck. The sound filling the air and then slowly becoming the air itself. She felt the Kale territory breathe. The pressure came, then the inevitable cost moving through her spine and the long bones of her arms. But it was different this time. Not the hollow, desperate drain of an empty vessel being wrung further, more like the ache of muscle that has been genuinely used. She swayed slightly. Norah Jonah's voice close. I'm here, she said. I'm still here. And then her legs made their decision and she was falling. And Jonah was there before she reached the ground, both arms around her, warm and solid, taking her weight completely. She did not hit the earth. She landed against his chest and stayed there, her cheek against his heartbeat, her hands finally dim and still. She did not lose consciousness. She breathed. She listened to his heart. Around them, the gathered wolves were utterly silent. It was Lena who broke it. She squirmed down from her mother's arms, crossed the frost-stiffened grass on small, certain feet, and stood in front of them with her chin up. She did it, Lena announced, with the solemn authority of someone reporting important news. She made the big light again. A sound moved through the Kale crowd, deep collective, the sound of people exhaling something they had been holding without knowing they were holding it. But from the Starfall survivors, there was only silence. Olivia had not moved. She stood exactly where she had stood at the gathering's edge, her arms loose at her sides, now her face entirely open in a way Norah had never seen on it, stripped of its usual composure, stripped of its practiced ease. She was staring at Norah's hands, at the place where the light had been, at the frost on the ground, undisturbed, the settlement standing whole and quiet around them. She was thinking. Norah could see it happening from across the circle. The pieces assembling themselves behind Olivia's eyes one by one, fitting together with the particular terrible precision of things that should have been understood long ago. The sickness, the cycling sourceless years, long sickness that had made the pack call her weak. The way it had come and gone without explanation, always worse after something none of them had thought to connect to her. The way Starfall had remained untouched while every surrounding pack bled. And then the attacks coming weeks after Norah left, not immediately weeks, because she had built one last barrier from the ground of that forest with the last thing left in her, and it had held just long enough, and then it had not. Olivia's hand went to her mouth. The color left her face in a single wave. "Oh," she said, barely a sound. "Oh, Norah." Norah met her eyes from across the circle. Olivia shook her head slowly. The way you shake your head at something you cannot take back or undo or make sense of, regardless of how long you look at it. Her eyes filled and spilled immediately, without warning, without the gradual build of ordinary grief. These were the tears of someone who has just understood the full dimension of a wrong they participated in and found it larger than they had the capacity to hold. All this time, Olivia said, her voice was breaking apart at its edges. "You were all of those years when you were sick, you were—" She couldn't finish it. She pressed both hands over her mouth and looked at Norah with eyes that were devastated and wide and asking a question that had no good answer. "Yes," Norah said quietly, "just that." Olivia closed her eyes. Jonah helped Norah sit. He kept one arm around her shoulders and she did not suggest he move it. She looked across at Olivia, who had lowered herself to sit on the cold ground, where she stood, her hands in her lap, the tears running freely down her face and not being addressed. Around them, the Kyle elders stood watching. Davin stood with his head bowed. Bryn, the elder woman who had voted with her chin raised and her eyes flat, had both hands pressed flat against her sternum as though trying to hold something in. The elder stepped forward. He looked at Norah, at the woman sitting in the frost, spent and pale and entirely calm. And then he looked at the people around her, Kyle and Starfall, both all of them standing inside walls she had built for the ones who had chosen her. "We need a word for what you are to this pack," he said. Norah looked around the circle at Petra's steady eyes, at Lena, who had sat down on the ground and was drawing something in the frost with one finger. At Olivia, who was looking at her now with a grief that was also underneath it, the beginning of understanding, at Jonah beside her, warm and immovable. She thought about Isolda finding a baby in tree roots and deciding without hesitation that she was worth the trouble. "She just Norah," she said. The elder looked at her for a moment, then he smiled, small and certain and permanent. "Just Norah," he agreed. "Who kept us alive," later when the settlement had returned to its morning work and Petra had filled her with enough food to embarrass her and the light had come up fully golden over the trees. She and Jonah sat side by side against the wall of the supply cabin in a patch of winter sun, their shoulders touching. She could feel the barrier around the Kyle territory deep and quiet and settled, humming at the very edge of her awareness like a note held long after the instrument is still. It would last. She knew it the way she knew the nature of wounds when she pressed her hands to them with a certainty that lived below reasoning. She was very tired, the good, clean kind of tired that follows something finished. "I have something to tell you," Jonah said. She turned her head to look at him. He was looking at the middle distance with the expression she recognized as his particular version of gathering himself. "I've been trying to tell you for approximately 6 years," he said. "I want you to know that the delay was entirely cowardice on my part and not a reflection of any ambiguity in the feeling itself." She looked at him for a moment, then she said, "I know." He turned to look at her. "You know Jonah I have known for a very long time." Something between exasperation and relief crossed his face. "And you said nothing. Neither did you," she pointed out. He opened his mouth, closed. It looked at the sky briefly as though requesting patience from some higher authority. Then he looked back at her, and the exasperation fell away entirely, leaving only the thing underneath it. Straightforward and unguarded and done waiting. I love you, he said. I have loved you since before I had the sense to understand what it was. I love who you are and how you carry yourself and the way you never once asked the world to be kinder before you kept saving it anyway. He paused. I should have said it before they had the chance to throw you out. I should have said it so many times before that, and I'm sorry I didn't. The winter sun sat warm on her face. Inside the walls she had built, the settlement moved through its mourning. Somewhere nearby, Lena was singing her tuneless song to herself, the sound carrying cleanly on the cold air. And from across the common ground, Olivia's voice drifted, answering a question someone had asked her, carrying in it a fragile and genuine warmth that sounded like someone learning very carefully to begin again. Norah looked at Jonah, at the face that had been one of the only true fixed points of her life for as long as she could remember. The boy who had sat beside her at meals when no one else would. The man who had ridden through 2 nights of rain to find her dying in a forest. The person who had stood 3 feet away this morning and given her one small nod that said, I'm here, go ahead, I'll catch you, and had been right on every count. She reached over and took his hand. His fingers closed around hers immediately without hesitation, the way they always did everything, entirely and without looking back. It's about time, she said quietly. He laughed. It was a real one, unguarded and warm, and she felt it against her shoulder where they pressed together. She leaned into it. She let herself lean around them inside the walls she had built with love for the people who had first loved her without reason. Her pack went on living.